was sitting here just now thinking, what better time and place to commemorate one of my most favorite pop culture properties than when I'm working on a painting to commemorate one of its most important movies. So, if you agree with that logic, then welcome to More Zone Media. Make it so. So, as you probably already know, one of my favorite and one of the most beloved and historically relevant pop culture properties in America is Star Trek, which I've been a fan of since 1991, when the franchise was celebrating its 25th, its 25th birthday, and I was sharing a 6th grade classroom with a kid that always seemed to wear the same Next Generation t-shirt and insist on calling me Mon Capitan. I think most people watching this already know the history and the cultural impact. So what I wanted to do, to save time and whatnot, was just talk about the repeatedly announced next movie in the so-called Kelvin timeline of Star Trek, which began 15 years ago this May 2024, with JJ Abrams' divisive yet successful Star Trek movie featuring a recast Kirk and crew from the original USS Enterprise NCC 1701. Now, that movie, it seemed to, albeit briefly, reinvigorate the franchise, but when they finally got around to making the sequel, it became clear that we were getting was not necessarily a retooled version of the Star Trek we knew, but rather a new cast playing out a pastiche of the franchise's greatest hits. And so, with 4 years between the first two films, I think interest started waning fast, and rumors even swirled that Abrams was losing what little interest he had in Star Trek to begin with. Why? Probably because Paramount was allegedly not going to allow him to just completely reinvent and replace the original series and their movies. So sure enough, Abrams jumped ship to helm the first of 3 new Star Wars movies for Disney, staying on only as a producer for 2016 Star Trek Beyond, a noticeably scaled down sequel that tried to be more like the 60s TV series, but emerged as little more than a mildly entertaining yet ultimately forgettable diversion. Now, despite low interest in even the tragic death of actor Anton Yelchin, who played Chekhov, Paramount has repeatedly and rather unprecedentedly announced the next movie, called at this moment Star Trek 4. Over the last 8 years, they've done it over and over again. The original reported premise is one that I utterly despise. It would have been a time travel buddy movie with Captain Kirk, and his father, George Kirk, as you may or may not remember, died in the first 20 minutes of the first 2009 Star Trek movie while Jim Kirk was being born. And, that aside from setting up a bulk of Jim Kirk's character development in the coming movies, I think those first 20 minutes, dramatically in terms of the action and drama combined, probably some of the best, in my opinion, in the franchise overall. And I thought that it would be upsetting if they brought George Kirk back, because that would kind of undermine, the bulk of character development we had seen in the previous 3 films, which isn't all that much, but it was something. You don't want to, especially because it wasn't all that much, you don't want to undermine that, do you? And it felt like they were only going to go this way because Chris Hemsworth, who played George Kirk in the 2009 film, has become such a big star, most notably because of playing Thor for Marvel and Disney. But, of course, he was a big star. He is a big star. And his salary would probably have eaten up a quarter of the film's budget. So, I personally don't think this movie will happen. It's not a safe bet right now. There was a time I remember, well, about a year or so ago, during one of their announcements, right afterwards, the very next day, the cast came out and said, wait a moment, there's another movie. Nobody told us. And the rumor was that Paramount only did that for 2 reasons. One, because, they thought, well, I don't know why they did it, but the biggest rumor was that this was, a ploy to maybe raise stock value for Paramount, CBS, Viacom, whatever the company is. That it wasn't actually something real, or at least not yet. Just something that they wanted to do, and they felt they needed to look like they were in the process and about to do it. That being said, I do think there's at least 1 or 2 ways that a 4th film could be made, and could be made very well. A 4th film, to be specific, in the Kelvin timeline, which is an alternate timeline, not the same one as the original series, or even the series of the 90s and early 2000s. And the way I think they could do it is to set up new characters for future movies, or find an in-narrative way to erase or undo the Kelvin timeline altogether. So that, if you can picture it, the final shot of the 4th and last movie with Chris Pine and his cast, the final shot is Chris Pine as Captain Kirk walking onto the bridge, not as the alternate version of Kirk that he's been playing, but albeit for just a few seconds, he can play the same Kirk that Shatner did many years ago. Of course, many longtime fans echo the likes of filmmaker Robert Burnett by saying that the next Star Trek movie has to cost far less money and tell a more innocent story that returns the focus to space exploration and camaraderie, all of which I tend to agree with. The lower budget would be non-negotiable. However, I think the stakes have to be higher than that, higher than just discovering another spatial anomaly. And I think this is doable on a lower budget because there have been movies that have demonstrated this, most notably being another time travel movie, ironically, Back to the Future, which was a coming-of-age story that felt bigger and more consequential than it really was, partly because of the way they used their special effects and the way, that Alan Silvestri gave a really big, kind of bombastic score to the movie. So much so it's almost surprising it worked, but it does. It did. So I think you can make a fairly modest film feel like something much bigger. one way I think this could be done is by returning the cinematic part of the franchise to its historically and socially relevant roots, while not being as politically preachy and heavy-handed as something like Star Trek Discovery. A fourth film in the Kelvin timeline could use something like, let's say, New Vulcan to explore issues of immigration, of what it's like to be refugees, and the struggles faced by a very old and distinguished people in their society having to essentially rebuild itself after losing its land and more than half of its native population. And this is a parallel to probably a number of cultures, most notably the Native Americans, so-called Indians in the United States, who lost a lot of their land when, I guess, the U.S. government kind of betrayed them a little bit. And that's all I'm going to say about it, because I don't want to get too controversial here. Also, since the recasting of Chekhov after Anton Yelkin's passing has been taken off the table, a fifth film could also find poignant ways to deal with that loss and use the fact that so much time has elapsed as an excuse to show more significant character growth in ways that finally justify the series of films and distinguish this version of Kirk and crew from the one introduced in the 1960s. There are also more sci-fi ways of making a fourth film feel bigger, including a sort of merging of my initial two requirements. After the success of Star Trek Picard's third and final season, the Next Generation is getting a resurgence of popularity. So, at the risk of resurrecting the whole time travel gimmick yet again, I see at least one specific and canon way in which the movie could introduce a few recast, slightly younger future members of the Enterprise D, what the Enterprise D will be in the Kelvin timeline, to Kirk and his crew of what would be the Enterprise A. In fact, a younger Kirk and Picard could both be dealing with the loss of a bridge officer under their command. Again, I see it, and I see it very specifically, but, you know, I don't have the actual rights to Star Trek, so I'm going to kind of keep that to myself. You can call it fan fiction, if you will. For now, however, we're talking about whatever Star Trek 4 could be, not what it is, not what it will be, but what it could be. Because right now it's still a what-if scenario at best. And again, I simply don't think it's a safe bet for any studio, but particularly for Paramount right now, to make this film. I'm sorry if this episode has been a bit rambling, but I hope you got something out of it. And maybe with any luck, I'll show you the painting when I'm done. Either way, like and subscribe, and I hope you'll come back for the next episode of Moore's on Media. Engage.